Welcome to this semester's first Frankie program event. My name is Priya Natarajan. I'm an astrophysicist and the current director of the Frankie program in Science and the Humanities, Yale's flagship interdisciplinary program. This unique program seeks to dissolve disciplinary silos and engage scholars from different fields to engage, learn, and collaborate. And it's one of the many efforts that have been generously supported by the Frankies at Yale, Richard and Barbara Frankie. I thank them both for this generosity and steadfast support of all our activities. So this evening, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you all to a wonderful talk by one of our own faculty, Gojko Barjamovic. He joined Yale last year after spending 11 years at the other place, Harvard. His research interests include institutional and civic order, wealth inequality, literacy, knowledge production, trade and mobility, ethnicity, and identity. And his scholarly output is driven by integrative questions that are characterized and exemplify cross-disciplinarity in a fundamental way. So he's a most apt speaker for our program. You might wonder, with all these specializations, he sounds like he must be working on sort of modern economies, modern society, and modern culture. But guess what? He's a specialist in the economic and social history of Assyria in the second millennium BCE, and also works on ancient foodways, including the Yale Babylonian recipes. You may remember that wonderful feast we had last year that he organized and threw for us with authentic recipes. He was also interested in understanding human ancient DNA, absolute chronology, and ancient metal. He works with colleagues in the field of economics on early markets and the trans-regional convergence of prices. He's just a remarkable scholar who not only brings to life one of the most interesting ancient civilizations on our planet, but offers these very brand new ways for us to connect our lives today to those of these ancestors. His work brings into sharper focus how the essential human qualities of curiosity, industry, and intent have shaped our evolution as a society. And to do this, he also has assembled a vast interdisciplinary treasure trove of tools involving archaeological science and history, as well as collaborations with biologists, metallurgists, astronomers, and what have you. So today, in his talk, he is going to be talking to us about a retelling of cross-continental exchange system that connected Mongolia to the Mediterranean 4,000 years ago. And he will integrate isotopic analysis, archaeozoology, prosopographical studies, historical geography, material culture, human pathology, to paint for us a vivid picture of the system of exchange, seen also uniquely from the vantage point of a single individual. It's just amazing that there is such a record. A trader named Zizizi, born in 1895 BCE, who had her life turned upside down by the very connectedness upon which her society was predicated. I have no doubt that we will all walk away with a brand new understanding and take of what globalization really means after your talk. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours, Gojko.
Thank you so much, Jim. And thank you all for coming in this somewhat precarious weather. I don't know how it was for you to park, but it certainly took me a while. Thank you, Priya, for the kind invitation to speak here today, as well as to Diane Barrett and Sandra Mallon-Bowles for organizing the event. As advertised, I'll present work that integrates historical and archaeological data with results from the sciences, focusing on a particular historical incidence and one particular individual in sort of her universal setting, to showcase how a reading from both the personal point of the person itself, as well as a reading from above, can be an effective way to study the past beyond the sort of deterministic approach offered by folks like biologist Jared Diamond, after whom this talk is named, kind of sort of tongue-in-cheek. When I work with economists, the first thing when they hear what I work on, they ask me, so do you know this book called Guns, Germs, and Steel? And I go, yeah, all right, I know that one. They're like, yeah, isn't that a fantastic book? And of course it is in a way. I'm very jealous. He can laugh all the way to the bank every day. He has summed up an entire story within 3 words in a title. That's how you sell a book. I can't do that with the kind of work I do. But I did my best by stealing his and now modifying it a little bit into where we're going here. My sister Shiduna is dead, and now Altab is ill. I can take no more. There is no one with whom I can speak, and no one to offer me courage. As you are my father and protector, as you are my mother, the day you hear my letter, you must write me one back. And do write good words in the letter. If no letter comes from you, I'll die. Zizizi wrote these words to her parents nearly 4,000 years ago as a deadly disease tore through her community. Her anxiety and sense of isolation is now a distant echo in clay. And yet we share in her emotion. We too are now familiar, all too familiar, with pandemics and loss and solitude. Zizizi's father was a successful businessman. Her mother, a prominent lady in town. The couple had recently returned to their native city of Assur, leaving Zizizi in the house in Kanesh, 600 miles to the northwest. But the epidemic killed her sibling, and now her husband, Altab, is fading. Zizizi is alone, and she begs for her parents to respond. Her call survives on a tablet in the ground, alongside 22,000 other such objects, only because Zizizi wrote in a script tied to durable clay as a medium. This random fact makes her community one of the most densely documented in the ancient world, albeit perhaps one of the least known outside a relatively small circle of specialists. And unlike most voices in ancient history, her call has not come down to us through a copy of copies, passed down through generations, carefully curated by guardians of culture or faith. Zizizi inscribed this unassuming object in her own hand, maybe as an archival copy of the letter she sent, maybe as a draft for a letter that never left. The tablet was not intentionally fired and was never meant to last. Regardless, this perceived ephemeron proved more durable than many literary treasures that the world has since lost, and its clay acts as a lens through which we can view Zizizi and her world without a filter of intervening redactors. Cuneiform literacy is not all that it took for her message to reach us. Like Pompeii, Kanesh was preserved through the misfortune that befell its citizens. Their houses destroyed in a conflagration that, however, happened to preserve more than 100 archives. The site was then spared of later looting, mostly anyway, and it avoided recent development, compound coincidence that provides access to Zizizi's life and the lives of many like her, whose voices usually remain silent in ancient history. Farmers, artisans, women, even children and slaves. The field of Assyriology in general deals with a superabundance of text, but there is a particular profusion of private archives during the first quarter of the second millennium BCE, when functional literacy was geographically and socially widespread. In earlier times, use of cuneiform was mostly restricted to institutional contexts. Later, it contracted to patrician households and the scholarly reveries of graying zealots. But the 250 years between the collapse of the Ur III state and the conquests of famous Hammurabi, roughly 2000 to 1750 BCE, saw an explosion in everyday cuneiform writing across large parts of Western Asia. This was a period of political fragmentation, flowering commerce, endemic warfare, and fierce insistence on local political autonomy. On the ideological level, hundreds of microstates constructed themselves in complex interaction with an imperial past across a region of highly mixed ethnic and linguistic heritage. Within this context arose the new literacy that mixed classic tradition with broad simplification. But even in this world, Zizizi's letter comes from an unusual corpus. She lived on the outskirts of what is today the Turkish regional capital of Kayseri, in the thriving city-state once called Kanesh, and now the archaeological site of Kültepe. There, she belonged to an emigrant community of some 900 to 1,000 traders, native to the city-state of Assur on the Tigris in modern-day Iraq. Their texts are written in a local northern vernacular of the Akkadian language that we call Old Assyrian. They are written in a simplified script using some 120 signs that could quickly be mastered. Here's an example of some of these texts that are kept in the Yale Babylonian collection just across the street here. They reflect, these texts, a commercial system based on trade in textile and metal. Tin metal and fine fabrics were carried from Assur by donkey caravan and sold for silver and gold in Anatolia in central Turkey. The closest parallels to these records from Kültepe come from much later times, from the medieval archives of northern Italy or in the Cairo Geniza. There are, of course, no genetic direct links, but as in those two examples, the Assyrian records reflect trading companies built on free enterprise, private initiative, and risk-based and profit-seeking behavior backed by capital investors. They utilized metal currency, credit bonds, and bearers' checks as instruments of finance. The material from Kültepe bears witness to commercial practices in a world that is otherwise often said to be characterized by institutional ownership, fixed prices, state mechanisms, and state merchants. For this reason, there has been a tendency to shelve Zizizi and her people as anomalous in broader studies of social evolution, an exception to confirm the rule of a world dominated by redistribution and state-controlled exchange of luxuries. Its relegation to evolutionary anomaly has allowed the case of Kanesh to be conveniently boxed away, one of the reasons why you are likely now never to have heard of it. However, a better understanding of the three underlying parameters of chronology and geography and social density of the Assyrian trade has begun to emerge in the last decade and a half, laying out important ramifications for an assessment of the scope and intensity of this trade in its regional perspective. Combining large-scale textual analysis with results drawn from scientific archaeology, we can situate the Assyrian trade in a network that is a much longer chain of exchange. It no longer constitutes an anomaly, but offers a powerful guide into a mostly undocumented but crucial aspect of ancient human history. An inventory of the actors involved in the Anatolian trade shows that about 1,000 or so citizens of Ashur lived and worked up in Anatolia during Zizizi's generation. This figure is remarkable in relation to the relatively modest size of Assur itself. Covering an area of less than 60 hectares, Assur is unlikely to have held a population of more than maybe 10,000 people at the time. So we're looking at a society where 10% of its citizenry, more or less permanently, were stationed in the commercial ports, far away. It was a nation of shopkeepers in the truest sense. But the number is also significant in a more general historical context. Consider that the commercial texts from places like Brügge during its heyday in the 15th century was home to about 400 foreign traders and their families. or that the Hanseatic ports of Bergen in Norway around the same date hosted about 2,000 foreigners during the summer months. The 900 hectares so far excavated in Kyltepe were home to no less than these 900 merchants belonging to some 50 trading families. The fact that a commercial settlement in Bronze Age Anatolia is comparable in size to those of some leading merchant market centers in Europe during the High Middle Ages once again speaks to the volume of trade that must have passed through Kanesh. The second parameter, chronology, has further compressed the scope and volume of the long-distance trade by showing that a great majority of the commercial records from Kyltepe date to a very short period of just 30 years, about 1895 to 1865 BCE by modern reckoning. This means that the quantities of goods recorded in the texts do not reflect perhaps a century of trade, but rather that of a single generation. Such a short time interval does not align well with the lens through which we normally observe change in, let's say, the archaeological record. Archaeologists are, by virtue of their data, typically able to perceive change on the scale of periods or strata, as shown here. The commercial archives from Kyltepe cover a tiny blip on this time scale. This little yellow thing is what corresponds to the curve you just saw here. This tiny blip that more than 95% of all the texts within this blip relate to just that one generation of inhabitants. The challenge of incorporating such a quick little window of text into the long sweep of the historical and archaeological record is not insurmountable, but it does require careful work to overcome. So, about 1,000 of the records that we have from Kyltepe were written by just 1,250 individuals during the 3 decades Zizizi was in Kanesh. The roughly 1,000 Assyrian citizens living in Anatolia and some 250 more with whom they communicated back home in Assur. To put these numbers into perspective, the 21,000 records contain about 1.25 million words, or just around twice as many words as you will find in the Hebrew Bible. So the social density of this material is therefore remarkable and in fact unparalleled anywhere in pre-classical antiquity. And it necessitates careful work as one approaches it to write its history. It's in this direction that today's talk will go. We will integrate readings from above with those from below to leverage some of the characteristic aspects of this Kyltepe material to showcase the type of analysis one can undertake and use it to address broader questions relevant to the social and economic history of the ancient world as a whole. I'll first approach things from above, linking texts to archaeological and scientific evidence in a bird's eye view to outline the contours of an interaction system that connected the Afro-Eurasian continents. I then flip the perspective and engage with the dense written material in which Zizizi and her contemporaries go from being social actors in a systemic model to being individuals with lived experiences in a reading from below. Finally, I join those two threads to address the historical and social implications of the pandemic that killed Zizizi's sister and to which also her husband ultimately succumbed. I ask what can be said about the disease that transformed her life and how it relates to the interconnected Bronze Age world to which she belonged. From human pathogen to personal ambition, I ask how a woman who sought financial security and gender parity in a foreign land had her life changed by the very connectedness upon which her society was predicated. I study her history as a set of convergent elements from above and from below. The generation of Zizizi's grandfathers had begun trade based on single ventures. By her parents' generation, ongoing enterprises were firmly established and most traders maintained double households, one at home in Assur and one abroad. But Zizizi and her contemporaries lived and operated most of their adult life abroad, as permanent agents in commercial enclaves. They maintained citizenship back in Assur, and the men kept the right to vote in its assemblies. They lived in houses that they had purchased from locals and ran their businesses from Kanesh or one of nearly 40 other Assyrian commercial settlements where they were subject to local law. A conservative minimum estimate of Assyrian commercial activities during the period of Zizizi's career is that at least 300 donkey loads of tin and textiles made it from Assur to Anatolia each year. This corresponds to several tons of tin and many thousand high-value fabrics. Trade in such a volume raises serious questions of production, financing, transport, infrastructure, and consumption. For instance, we know that the Assyrian traders, upon arrival in Anatolia, sold most of their donkeys used to transport their goods. Who bred, fed, and trained the hundreds of animals needed by the merchants each year? Who produced the required saddling or leather goods? And how about the exported textiles? These were highly valuable fabrics that could occasionally fetch the price of a house. Who managed the chain of operations to pluck and wash and comb and dye and weave the fiber, and where did such work take place? And what about transport? Hundreds of donkeys, each with its own human driver, would spend 6 weeks on the journey. Who produced the fodder consumed by the donkeys as they passed through the inns of Syria and Anatolia? Where did the workforce come from? How was the trade monitored and guarded? Who maintained the roads, bridges, and guard posts mentioned in the business records? Did taxation and the proceeds from the traffic change local communities and economies? And what effects did the trade have on the interaction between settled and mobile communities in the ecologically marginal zones that these guys passed through? The texts don't answer all of these questions. They make at best glancing references to the existence of the complex infrastructure behind them, but the sources as we have them make sense only if we infer the existence of the extensive structure of supporting institutions and industries that are otherwise unseen. And they give rise to questions that can only be effectively addressed through collaboration between historians, archaeologists, faunal and plant experts, trace residue analysts, metallurgists, etc. Work on the historical geography has also made it clear that the Assyrian commercial circuit did not stand alone or unchallenged within the world in which it operated. Rather, the material hints at several complementary and competing circuits. The Assyrian merchants connected directly to at least 2 other major networks, one that reached Ashur from the Gulf and Iran, and another one that led west from Anatolia and into the Aegean, into what is today the Eastern Mediterranean. Importantly, one can also show that other regions are missing in the Assyrian records, and that Western Asia at the time was divided into several networks of fiercely guarded, commercially opposing monopolies. This was a system that reduced risk and replaced insurance with local liability. In some territories, traders could not sell their goods locally, but could negotiate treaties of transit. Other areas allowed both transit and trade. Many places forbade their presence entirely. The Assyrian system was characterized by a high degree of political and economic specialization, part and parcel of a package that included collective governance, high literacy, a postal service, complex legal institutions, and new tools of financing. Again, had this not been 4,000 years ago, but 1,000 years ago, you would maybe not have lifted an eyebrow. You could think of the Hanseatic League, the city-states in Russia, Novgorod, etc. But for this part of the world, this has been unknown until now. There would have been other networks in operation here. Likely they would have worked differently. Some of them could have been based on venture trade, some maybe on maritime trade, some maybe exchange modes that weren't trade at all, but other types of exchange. The networks would be interdependent by virtue of the commodities that flowed through them, but functioned autonomously once goods passed from one network into the other. The key product traded by the Assyrians was tin. Its geographic origin has been debated for decades and must now be re-examined in the light of the realization that of the substantial volume attested in the records. The merchants of Assur did not themselves hold control over the sources of tin. Other commercial circuits were responsible for bringing tin to market, and the price in Assur was subject to supply and demand. That much we know. Now, while copper is abundant in Eurasia, tin is about 30 times scarcer, and conditions under which tin deposits are formed are geologically fairly limited. Yet, of course, we are in the Bronze Age, and the use of tin in weapons and armor throughout the second millennium BCE means that the acquisition of tin was a strategic concern. Sometimes this has been compared to the one held by crude oil today, hopefully not for much longer. Scholars have for more than half a century debated the possible sources supplying Western Asia and the Mediterranean. But what has really changed things is the recent advancement in tracing the origin of tin through isotope analysis that have put such debates on much more solid ground by showing that two regions in particular seem to have been the primary suppliers to the entire area. Both are surprisingly distant. One is the Western Tian Shan Range in modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, where extensive mining operations dating to the period contemporaneous with Zizizi have been documented. Archaeological work additionally points to sources further east in the Altai Mountains on the very frontier with China. But more isotopic analysis is needed to link those findings to metal objects in the east and west. In a recent study, a research team that I was part of showed that tin coming from a mine called Mushiston in northern Tajikistan would have contributed to the tin cargo on the famous Uluburun shipwreck that sank off of the coast of Turkey around 600 years after the life of Zizizi in 1330 BCE, give or take. Its presence there first necessitates that small-scale highland populations mined these ores under extremely challenging conditions, out on the right of this map, then that someone moved the metal for nearly 2,000 miles across the Eurasian landmass to reach the Mediterranean. The date of the Uluburun shipwreck, as I say, is 500-600 years after the archives from Kültepe, pointing to the persistence of a chronologically robust tin circuit. We can also see that there are much earlier bronze finds that point to Eastern connections. For instance, bronze objects coming from the site of Troy in Western Turkey. So maybe I can make my shadow reach it. No, I can't. But it's all the way up in the left-hand corner there. That would be Troy. Have been shown to contain tin from these very remote deposits. The finding correlates with a convergence of Anatolian, Central Asian and Egyptian networks reflected in the palatial archives of the site called Ebla in Syria, which date to about 2500 BCE. They are essentially the earliest large archives we have anywhere in the world, and, well, roughly 6 centuries earlier than Zizizi. We thus seem to see what are the signs of a long-lasting system that brought tin to the Mediterranean long before and after the texts from Kültepe document the interaction in more detail. However, the chronological density and high volume of the trade conducted by Zizizi and her contemporaries make it clear that the mining and transport we should be looking for are orders of magnitude larger than what has ever been thought before. We currently just see the contours of the system, a system that must have connected the really populated areas of the globe, places like Egypt and Anatolia and Mesopotamia, through individual objects, such as hippo ivories or an Egyptian textile found up in Turkey, or the old Assyrian merchant seals found down in a treasure called the Todd treasure in Egypt. But when several metric tons of tin are said to have passed through the hands of the Assyrians every year, then we need to ask how much more tin went to the densely populated urban centers of Iran, Babylonia, Syria, and Egypt and Crete. And by what routes? The people who are producing this stuff live far away, and they are not, at least it seems, settled in an urban way. Many of them were probably mobile pastoralists who are forming, we assume, a dense network of communities connected by culture, exchange, and possibly language in the Piedmont regions of the so-called Inner Asian Mountain Corridor. From the northern edges of the Iranian plateau and along the Tian Shan all the way to China, these people must have carried out mining and distribution of tin ores on a staggering scale. Evidence for tin extraction is attested from around 1900 at a site called La Paz in Uzbekistan, and its characteristic ore profiles have recently been shown to recur in bronze objects found just 100 yards from Zizizi's house at Kültepe. But Bronze Age mines much further away at the eastern end of the Indo-Asian mountain corridor, equidistant between Istanbul and Beijing, hint at a tin network spanning the entire Eurasian continent. An eastward expansion of farmer pastoralists after 2000 BCE have been linked by archaeologists also to the exploitation of tin metal, so that on the eastern Asian side of the landmass, the growth of tin-bronze metallurgy in China in the early second millennium, contemporary with Zizizi, has been connected to the relatively rapid adoption of a metallurgical toolkit moving from the steppe fringe. So you can sort of geographically, you can view this entire area as sort of a sea of grass, as indicated on this map with a green shade of color, that connects the Eurasian continent north of the mountainous areas. And you have some drawings there for, if there are any archaeologists in the room, sort of finds from China that sort of suggest this interrelation with the grassland area right around this time, where the bronze for the first time comes into China. As you know, later on in Chinese history, and this is associated almost with the bells and these objects that are made of bronze are a very sort of culturally cognizant Chinese thing. While more research is, of course, likely to add much more nuance to the picture, the point I'm trying to make here is simple, that while there were many sources of tin supplying the population centers of the Bronze Age world, and several routes led from core extraction centers to areas of distribution and consumption, connections appear to have been centered, at least for a time, on the areas around the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor. In a different paper, I've tried to pull together the evidence we have of the knowledge that people living in Mesopotamia, in modern-day Iraq, would have had of these, to them, incredibly distant areas. And we can actually start to plot stuff onto the map surprisingly far away, it seems, from their own backyard. Any definite signs of the processes that would have facilitated this exchange remain elusive for the time being, except for the volume of tin explicitly quantified and recorded by the ton in the text from Kültepe, which would have required a sustained extraction on a vast scale. Stateless and partially mobile populations linked to a large-scale extraction in other places like Oman, that supplied Mesopotamia for a few centuries with things like copper, show how sort of basically stateless societies may have operated far away from the urban world. However, in breaking news just a month and a half ago, this site was just reported by a team led by Miljana Radivojevic and Dan Lawrence of Cambridge and Durham, respectively, which is this mega site that they have not started excavating yet, a place called Semiyarka, which, as you can see on the map, is essentially on the border between Kazakhstan, Russia and China over in the Altai. But already from surface photos and stuff, you can see that something very large is going on, and it seems to date, what is on the surface seems to date to this exact period that we're looking for here. So how does this work with what else we can pick up on in Mesopotamia? Well, there's one interesting study done by an archaeozoologist, Haskell Greenfield, who looked at a relatively small material of something extremely mundane, people's kitchen waste. And he did that so far mainly in areas of what is today Israel, Palestine, and northern central Turkey. But looking through people's animal bone waste, so essentially meat that they would have been eating and the remains of the butchering of that meat, he developed a technology which allowed him to recognize whether the tools used for the butchering were predominantly stone or metal. And it's something to do with the groove. The stone is much sharper than the metal, so you get a much more sort of V-shaped groove out of it. Very basic stuff, but what we should be paying attention to here is the statistical distribution between the early Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age. Middle Bronze Age, remember, is when our friend Zizizi is alive. And you'll see that in the early Bronze Age, almost all of the household waste was butchered. Well, the animals in it were butchered using stone tools. And there's an almost complete flip to the Middle Bronze Age, so that between 90 and 95% of the stuff in the early Bronze Age and most sites is done with stone tools, and it's the other way around in the Middle Bronze Age. So even though there was bronze around in the early Bronze Age, hence its name, it really seems to kick in on a completely different, massive scale, which means that on an everyday sort of household level, Mr. and Mrs., whoever lives somewhere, and what they're eating, they're carving with metal. A reading of the Kulturpe text from above has brought us far away from Zizizi's pleading words and towards tin mining, Asian pastoralists, and kitchen waste. But through the intersection of text and archaeology, our panned-out view from the clay she wrote to a bird's-eye view of a high-density, large-scale commercial network is complete. The realization that the ancient world was interconnected is not new. This thing is now a bit over, 15 or so, give or take, years old, done by a colleague in France, Bourgeard. However, what is new is the nature of this system as an interlocking, interdependent structure, as well as the volume and intensity with which it functioned, which is set into contexts and proportion only by the chance survival of the records kept by Zizizi and her contemporaries. So now I suggest we look her way and take a dive into her records from below. From Indilum and Ishtarbashti to Zizizi. You are our daughter. Do you no longer know your mother or your father? When I gave Altab as your husband, I spent 5 pounds of silver. And when Altab, your husband, died, you took a native man in marriage. And so I spent another 5 pounds of silver on your nuptials. My sons and I no longer count in your eyes. If we had done so, I would treat you like a daughter. But ever since I moved back to the city, I have taken financial hits, while you have not even mentioned my name. You have put me to shame before your ancestral gods. Zizizi is not a particularly well attested individual in Kulturpe. She occurs only in 14 texts. That's why I can talk about her today, compared, for instance, to her father's correspondence of nearly 500 mentions. One can nonetheless follow her through an important part of her adult life to get some idea of her fate and fortune. Her father came out of a dynasty probably founded by his grandfather, Amur-Ili. His father, Shulaban, was one of 3 brothers who set up shop in Anatolia and formed a collaboration, for the most part amicable, but not always, that ran for decades before Imdi-Ilum joined the family business. This meant that he and his 5 siblings had plenty of uncles and aunts and cousins and nieces and nephews to work with in their extended family network. Although each nuclear family operated as an autonomous unit, cooperation and resource sharing was common. Like so many other people in her generation and his generation, Imdi-Ilum began his professional life as a junior merchant in charge of taking shipments from Ashur up to Kanesh and beyond. Waiting for the news that the passes of the Taurus Mountains were finally free of ice, he would leave Ashur around spring equinox and travel with caravan managers and donkey drivers from inn to inn along the guarded roads of Syria in the direction of the Euphrates. Crossing the river on heavy wooden rafts, he would begin the arduous climb of more than 3,000 feet across the very tectonic fault that caused devastation to the region in 2018 and 19, as you may remember. After weeks of perilous ascent through passes that would take his donkeys up to 6,000 feet above sea level, he would finally see the snow-capped mountain volcano known to the natives as the Gatekeeper, and know that he was approaching the Karnish Plain. Here you go, here's the Gatekeeper. Upon arrival, he would be met with orders, the mail having overtaken him on one of the fast-traveling postal caravans. And based on these, he would either sell his goods in Karnish and pay duties and taxes before rushing back to Assur in the hope of making a second trip before first frost, or he would take the shipment with him to one of the 32 or so other market towns frequented by the Assyrians across central Turkey, where he would sell it for added profit. Year after year, he would build his wealth from the small working capital he had received as part of each trip. And after a decade, he had the funds to purchase property of his own in Karnish and settle as a permanently stationed agent for his father's business. He also secured the support of wealthy investors with whom he had built relations during his time in shipping, and with their capital, he began to trade at large. He could now marry and start a family. Breaking with earlier practice, Imdi Ilam found a wife in Assur, but brought her with him to Karnish, where she would manage the house while he plied the roads of Turkey. They would spend the highland winters together in Karnish, surrounded by kinsmen and Assyrian neighbors in a densely settled neighborhood. Imdi Ilam was privileged to have his affairs in Ashur managed by his capable sisters, Shimat Ashur and Taram Kubi. The former was not married, but was consecrated to the city god as a priestess. The latter, Taram Kubi, was married to a wealthy merchant of herself, a man named Inaya, son of Elali, who also spent most of his life in Karnish. She seems to have proficiently managed both her husband's and her brother's affairs down in Assur. She occasionally sends gifts and letters to her sister-in-law in Karnish, but her writing more typically consists of business correspondence with her brother. She regularly berates him for his singular focus on profit at the expense of his duties as a custodian for the family ancestors. Here in Ashur, we consulted the female dream interpreters and diviners and the spirits of the dead, and divine Ashur keeps on warning you. You love money, you hate your life. Imdi Ilam sent both sisters jewelry, footwear, and other objects from Karnish, while his wife Ishtarbashti sent her sisters-in-law cash silver. In addition to her correspondence with Imdi Ilam, a dozen or so emotional letters survive from Taram Kubi to her husband, Inaya, and she wrote news of their house and their children, some of who were still with her, and it's clear that her life was both financially and emotionally very difficult, and that she felt abandoned by her husband. As her children grew up and slowly left her to join the trade in Anatolia, Taram Kubi repeatedly complains that she has been left alone in an empty house with little money. Like most merchant wives in Assur, Taram Kubi wove textiles and sent them to Karnish for sale. Alongside her dowry, the proceeds of such sales were essentially hers and often seem to have gone towards her daily upkeep. She formed a network with other women, both in Assur and Karnish, with whom she would trade objects and information, a small parallel society to the men's world of brisk trade. As financial representative for her husband, however, she also kept in contact with his investors and collaborators, as well as the authorities of City Hall. In some cases, she would direct family funds towards the religious institutions in the city, and in many ways typifying the women in Assur of her generation and the societal expectations to which they were subject. Her brief biography will serve as a point of contrast for what is to come. In Karnish, Imdi Ilam and Ishtarbashti raised at least 4 children together. Firstborn among them was a girl whom they named Ishtarbashti, after her mother, but who usually went by her nickname, Zizizi. Her 2 younger brothers were Puzurishtar and Amurili. Puzurishtar married the native woman Ana Anna and worked mainly out of Karnish, and Amurili was still a young man when his parents returned to Assur, so they seemingly brought him along with them. The sisters, Taramkubi and Shimat Ashur, wrote to inform their brother that they had purchased a mansion for him at the astronomical price of 20 pounds of silver down in Ashur, and this was presumably the property into which the family would move. They continued doing business from Assur and used their connections in Kanesh to conduct operations abroad. After their departure, their role of maintaining family business in Kanesh, somewhat unconventionally, went to Zizizi instead of her brother, Puzurishtar. She, in turn, seems to have flipped the usual pattern of trade on its head by managing an import business from her house in Kanesh. In a letter from Assur, her father offered to make purchases for 10 pounds of silver in the city on her behalf and to send her younger brother Amur-Ili with the shipment to Anatolia. However, the father is strict about her not allowing Amur-Ili to spend a single night in Kanesh before sending him on his way back. Open his ears and let him know fear. He should not chase bread and beer, but be a man. While Zizizi remained at home to manage the business and storage, her spouse, Al-Tab, plied the roads of Anatolia with merchandise, and this seemingly went on until the day catastrophe struck with the epidemic hitting Kanesh. The disease is mentioned in a handful of letters coming out of different houses that make reference to the mutanu, the death, hitting both Kanesh and Ashur. Many people died, including Zizizi's husband, Al-Tab, and her sister. The event came to represent a major turning point for Zizizi. She left Kanesh and returned to Assur, at least for a while, since the letter she sent to her brother in Kanesh urges him to come to the city so that she may travel with him back to Anatolia. Don't you know that if I'm not to scold you today, you must come quickly so that I can depart with you and watch over yours and your father's house in Kanesh, and let no one harm your father's house. This is because Assyrian women could not travel unescorted, and Zizizi needed her brother to come to Ashur and pick her back up to Anatolia. It's perhaps best not too much of a stretch of imagination to picture the difficulty of the situation she found herself in. Her position before the pandemic was that of a spouse of an itinerant Assyrian trader in Kanesh and manager of her family estate in his absence. She spent most of her time directing business while Al-Tab was on the road. Now, as a widow, she had lost status, male protection, and was forced to contend with a more restrictive regime back under the roof of her father in Assur. Kaneshite society also had a very different legal attitude towards women than her native city. In Kanesh, husband and wife were equal legally and had no major financial transaction, a purchase or a loan or a sale, could be made without a couple's mutual consent. Even the state of Kanesh itself was led by a woman at the time Zizizi lived there. The queen had great military and political power that spanned a large region. And finally, the main deity up in Kanesh was a goddess, Anna, mother, while her male consort, Nebes, the sky, and their son, Perwa, rock, played second fiddle. In Assur, on the other hand, women were not autonomous legal entities unless they happened to be of the unmarried, consecrated kind, like Shimat Ashur, the older sister of her mother, Zizizi's mother. Women were not free to travel, but remained under the formal supervision of their father until the day they married, and after that under their husband. Zizizi could, of course, hope to keep close ties with her parental household the way her aunt, Taramkubi, had done, but formally for women, marriage was a process of transfer from into a new family and its ancestral cult, and only the dowry would remain hers to take back in case of death or divorce. So, being back under her father's roof in Ashur may well be what Zizizi hoped for after her husband's death, if we are to judge by her anxious plea of tonight's opening quote. But it seems that she soon came to look for ways to return to Kanesh and to obtain her father's permission to do so. We don't know exactly how she managed to return, but once back, she again took up residence in the family house. At this time, she wed not a citizen of Ashur, but a local guy who bore the Hittite name Anua. A letter from her mother in Assur refers to, quote, his children, suggesting that Anua may have brought children from a previous marriage into the house. A reference to the time after you were deprived of your daughter, in turn, indicates that Anua and Zizizi had a baby girl who did not live to adolescence. The couple seems to have continued the family engagement in the international import business. Imdiilum and Ishtarbashti would send consignments from Assur with instructions to Zizizi and Anua on where to ship them further into Anatolia. Anua seems to have directly handled sales of these goods in collaboration with Assyrian vendors. It was highly unusual for a local to work so closely with the expat community of Assyrians. Usually the Assyrians, as I said before, were fiercely protective of their position as neutral intermediaries in this competitive political landscape of Anatolia. In turn, Zizizi stayed at home to oversee the business. A couple of letters received during this time place her first in the letterhead as a sign of her ascent in status to a senior merchant. It seems that the couple also began to diversify their portfolio, perhaps leveraging Anua's local status to offer loans to members of the native community. They would accept partial repayment in commodities rather than cash silver. Furthermore, 2 contracts record selling off a family member to Zizizi against a redemption clause. These could be straight purchases of family slaves, but they could also be the result of locals defaulting on loans and effectively providing labor to pay back their debt. The capital sum of 10 pounds of silver invested on her behalf by her father suggested that Zizizi had become a highly successful entrepreneur with the liberty and autonomy to build her own business. The scolding letter from home, with which I opened the third part of this talk, implies that she gradually distanced her business from the paternal estate, causing her father to react in the strongest terms. Let us look at it again with fresh eyes. When I gave Altab to you as husband, I spent 5 pounds of silver. And when Altab, your husband, died, you took a native man in marriage, and I spent another 5 pounds of silver on your nuptials. The passage is telling in several ways. A father's frustration with his daughter's detachment is juxtaposed with the favors he provided her to help her find her feet, at least in his optics. He reveals also a significant flip in her agency over the 2 marriages. In the first marriage, he gave Altab to Zizizi. In the second marriage, she took a native man as her husband. The second passage. My sons and I no longer matter in your eyes, but ever since I moved to the city, I have taken financial hits, while you have not even mentioned my name. Is of course rhetorical in nature, but does suggest a shift in power. As Imdiilum's business was in decline, the alleged silence of Zizizi implies that she may have been thriving, while the letter ends in a broken passage taking Imdiilum's rhetoric to the level of the family spirits. The implied accusation is that she has abandoned her family after her father, has helped her in ways that were probably unusual for the time, allowing his daughter equal, perhaps higher status than her male siblings. And now he's a fool in the face of his fathers. We don't know how things went for Zizizi. The last dated text mentioning Imdiilum was written in 1869 BCE, and Zizizi may well have lived for another 30 years, seeing as the archive containing her records was still present when the conflagration destroyed her house in 1838. A laconic mention of an offering given to a deceased person named Ishtarbashti in a text from a completely different archive at Ganesh may refer to Zizizi by her formal name. The text refers also to veils, which were typically used in mourning, and the sacrifice of sheep to the spirits of stillborn children, which may imply that the woman mentioned died in childbirth. But the connection with Zizizi is impossible to prove. Like so many others, she simply vanishes from our view as suddenly as she and her contemporaries first appeared. Shadows on clay, frozen in time by furious fire. After a close reading of 14 texts, we can see the outlines of a biography of a woman who lived and died at Kiltepe nearly 4,000 years ago. The account is by no means complete, and the whole material can admittedly lend itself to unwarranted speculation as much as dead certainties. The reading, however, does showcase elements that a history from below offers a different understanding of Kanashite societies that is in some ways restrained by the history from above. 14 texts out of 21,000 that situate just one individual into her local and global setting. These documents offer glimpses of her life as an agent abroad and interactions with the host community that provided a kind of social and economic freedom that a woman could not enjoy in Assur. What was seemingly a major turning point in her life, the pandemic, that ravaged her community and robbed her of her husband, but which also allowed her to start anew, to marry a local man and to set up a business of her own. Pandemics are frequent in history, and no pathology studies have yet been carried out on Bronze Age skeletons from Kültepe itself, but texts from the site refer to at least 2 major outbreaks, some 30 years apart, which one can probably relate to the nature of the trade that actually supported it. Medieval historians identify the growing connectivity of the 14th century of the Common Era as one of the root causes for the quick and devastating spread of the bubonic plague. Merchant ships and desert caravans acted as prime vectors for the spread of the disease. Can we see in the life of Zizizi, using the 2 lenses from above and below, a similar continental system of trade facilitating the spread of a deadly pandemic? A 2018 study traces the origins of pestis, the bacterium that causes pneumonic plague, and shows that in its early stages of evolution it lacked the key genetic mutation required for flea adaptation. Genomes retrieved from individuals buried shortly after 2000 BC in the Asian steppe, however, show that right around that time, pestis became able to survive in the gut of a flea, allowing for the transmission of the vastly more contagious bubonic plague. Traveling by flea, pestis could now ride along with rats and dogs, following humans on their journeys and into their homes. Going through the published evidence, there are reports of such mutated pathogens appearing in an individual buried in the Altai foothills at a place called Kitmanovo, who belongs to the very people, the semi-mobile steppe dwellers of the inner Asian mountain corridor, whom we now know were mining the tin traded by Zizizi. Rather than guns and germs and steel, the world of Zizizi was thus connected by swords and germs and tin. Transcontinental trade and dreadful disease linking to one woman's ambition in a patriarchal society. Reading from above and below produces histories in which Kanish comes back to life, like Le Roi Le Drise Montaillou, where Zizizi, by way of her actions, concurrently reflects personal beliefs and global events, like in Ginsburg's Menocchio. New frontiers lie in a continued closer integration of the historical and archaeological and scientific data, and call for teams of scholars to ask the big questions of small places that have so long been programmatically envisioned. Kültepe provides a particularly compelling cluster of written, visual, and material sources, many of which you have seen today, of exceptional social and chronological density that allow the writing of such histories. A double perspective, studying interaction patterns on a continental scale and connecting them to individual lived experiences, that has the power to call back into focus, even briefly, the interactions of a world and its people 4,000 years ago. People such as Ingdilum and Taramkubi and Zizizi. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gojko, for this fantastic and really fascinating talk. So we have time for a few questions before we can head out to a small reception outside. So, questions?
No, microphone. Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about this really surprising and rich way that families, as you said, settled about 600 miles apart. Were there any reasons why someone might rather settle in Karnish? You said one of them, which is that perhaps a woman might find greater freedom there to conduct her affairs, but was it also a better neighborhood than perhaps the one they came from in Assur? Were there other reasons why, or was it simply that it was good for the family business for a few people to settle there and some to stay home? And connected to that, you said that they kept their citizenship, which included the right to vote, presumably not by mail. But what were the ramifications of keeping citizenship?
Those are great questions, and yes, they are interwoven. So they are mobile to the extent that they're allowed to settle by the Anatolian city-states, effectively, where they are conducting the trade, and they're allowed to settle there only for that purpose. So they're not essentially They're not tourists or moving because the weather is better up there. It is cooler in the summer, that's for sure. And the wine is probably also better, but rather because of the trade. This is an agent-based trade, at least during these generations of Indilum and Zizizi. That seems to change a little bit later on. And so the society changes with the way that this works. But you have the main investors down in Ashur, and we know very little about them because their texts are missing. We don't have any texts from this period from Ashur, because Ashur goes from being a republican city-state at this period, transforms into the center of the world empire, much like Rome 2,000 years later. So it goes from republic to empire, and with it, they build everything on top of these old layers from the Bronze Age. So we don't have that. But what we can see is that there are these major investors down there. They are the big money people. Imdilum is one of them, at least for a while. He seems to lose quite a bit of his fortune during his life. So they're not all doing well. But being down there means that you can participate in the local political life. And if you are a freeborn male, you can vote in the assembly. The assembly has two chambers, an upper and lower. And the upper chamber, referred to as the elders, seem to sort of be family leaders. That's more or less what we know about it. Again, it's similar in structure to Athens and places like that 1,500 years later. Not because they're related in any way, but because that's a logical way of doing things. But it means that when you move away from political influence. And therefore, typically, the people who move are the younger people. They are the agents. And if they can, they will try to build a fortune so that they can move back, exactly as Imdilum did. So that's how that works. Retaining the citizenship up in Anatolia means that they have expatriate legal rights. And a lot of our texts actually attest to that because they're legal records. As always with business, shit happens, things go wrong, and they get into legal trouble with each other and with the societies in which they live. And they are subject to local law in dealings with the locals, but retain their kind of extra territorial rights within their own community. And so Assyrian law applies when they deal with one another. And therefore, that's so important for them to always stress this fact that they are citizens of Assur. It also means that they are not liable to the same taxation in kind mechanisms that function up in Anatolia. Normally, if you are an Anatolian and you own a house, then with that house comes the, as far as we can see, the responsibility to work in the army actively, to work perhaps a plot of land for the great palatial estate, and etc. These states are very different than by not republics, they're monarchies. And all land seems to be owned by the palace in these places. So that's how that works. The Assyrians are free of that. So therefore, there are all these very interesting kind of mechanisms where you can see that they're playing on their citizenship.
If I may ask a question. So I think it's really fascinating to hear about the many roles that Zizizi kind of plays. And I was curious, so it looks like women were not participating in the political sphere, but they clearly were participating in the public sphere. So I really want to understand in terms of actual power, how have you reconstructed their sort of place in society?
The women, as you say, they don't seem to be directly involved in political life, but clearly they have a lot of soft power. And especially when, like in the example of Zizizi's aunt, Taram Kubi, when the husband moves and the woman stays behind in Assur, she gets an extraordinary amount of executive power because she is running the household on an everyday basis. And this is where we know this most, because that's the kind of situation that fosters the correspondence that we can then, use to. We know very little about Imdilum and his.
Completely accepted is quite
That's
exceptional, right?
completely accepted, yes. But they're clearly restrained at the same time, right? They're not legal personae per se. They cannot, for instance, so they don't have system of courts. Their laws are administered through the city assembly, again, much like in Athens. So you can't be part of that if you're a woman, it seems. So you have to have a representative for you in the assembly if you want something done. And that's how they manage that then.
But they have the autonomy to sign transactions, as it were, right? And make...
Yes. And they have their own economy. So they can make money on their own. As I said, one way that they do that is to produce laboriously these luxury textiles, those who are capable of doing that, and they can make a lot of money on that. But others like Zizizi also enter the trade, right? And there's much more money to be found. The problem there is that you need a certain amount to start investing. That's what she got from her father, and which was very rare. But it does happen to other women as well. Taram Kubi, the aunt there, is a fascinating character because she sort of doesn't make it in a way through this system and really struggles. And we have all these letters, both to her brother and her husband up in Anatolia. And so a couple of years ago, a French documentary team made a very interesting documentary film about her, actually. So that exists and is out there. Look her up if you want to.
Also very curious about this other woman you mentioned who didn't marry and was consecrated to the gods. What is that? What kind of status is that? Is that like outside social norms, or is that...
They become man-like in a sense when it comes to a male, let's say the gender, right? In terms of their status. We don't know much about it from Assur, but there are other cities surrounding Assur where we have the archives of these women surviving. So there's a place called Sippar, which is the neighboring city of Assur.
And this was and there was a population of them. This is not unusual.
So there is a kind of almost a convent of like 30 or 40 of them. And what happens is, since they're not able, so they're consecrated and unmarried, so they cannot produce issue, and therefore they cannot inherit or pass on fortunes. So what they do is that they develop this system of adoption. So younger consecrated women are then adopted by their older colleagues, and then fortunes are passed down. And what we have from Sippar are all these interesting court cases where families try to infringe upon these fortunes by trying to sort of sue their sisters, essentially, to take away from them. And they categorically lose in every case we have. So that's interesting.
That's interesting.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. If not, let's thank Gojko for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Priya.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.